Salut, c'est Shox de G2.
Practically everyone who plays Counter-Strike, from the absolute rank beginner to the most seasoned professional, force buys within the game. It's very, very rare that people do pure ecos or that people only buy when they have maximum money for armor, a rifle, and now in the modern day, utility usually is considered part of the full buy as well, and an essential and often integral part at the professional level of a full buy and what a full buy represents. In fact, funnily enough, force buys are something which newer players do even when they don't understand the principle, they don't understand the concept. They do it mistakenly, not understanding the concept of saving, of economy management, and simply buy whatever the best weapons they can buy or would like to buy with whatever money they happen to have at the beginning of a round, not understanding the longer aspect of the game, the more macro element, and the fact that you have to sync up with your teammates to increase your chances of winning particular rounds. Now, funnily enough, though, force buying wasn't actually a significant concept until a few years into the development of Counter-Strike, actually. In the first few years of Counter-Strike, there was a lot more pure ecos. There were people who did pure Glock ecos with nothing bought whatsoever, perhaps one flash on the team, perhaps a smoke to get past a choke point. There were full gun round buys more often, where people waited until they had maximum money to do a full gun buy. They very rarely bought with 4, even if 4 people could get the rifles, unless it was a particular key round in the game where you were going to lose the game and there was almost no chance of winning. You had very few of the extremes taking place. Or rather, you had nearly always the extremes taking place back then, which now are the extremes which very rarely take place. Now, part of that is, yes, the development of the game and people figuring out when you can gamble, etc. But a bigger part of it, actually, was that there was less diversity in the weapons, and particularly in terms of how viable the weapons were. The Galil and FAMAS weren't introduced until CS 1.6, so they didn't come out until the latter part of 2003. So for the first few years of CPLs and World Cyber Games and the SWC, we didn't have these weapons, and therefore there wasn't a cheaper, more affordable option to buy, perhaps without head armor, and therefore have some semblance of a buy, which meant if your teammates could buy a full rifle and armor and perhaps some utility, you could have a force buy or a mixed buy, or you could try and work a little magic with a very low econ buy. That just wasn't possible before, because no one really, it's never really been viable to just buy the rifle and no armor whatsoever. That kind of a glass cannon approach never really worked at any point, and funnily enough, hasn't really worked even in the force buy era. People don't tend to do that. So interesting enough, yes, the Galil and the FAMAS being brought in allowed people to do force buys. North Americans obviously would do it quite often. A lot of the better European teams, for example, the Swedes and the Danes, wouldn't really do it that often unless it was a one-off gimmick play or a gamble. Like, for example, famously in the WCG 2008 final, which the Denmark's MTW won, where they bought a scout on train and managed to pick up a couple of crucial kills against SK Gaming, which really helped them to go and win the gold medal that year. Now, teams that were actually famous for how effective they were and how much they abused the force buy when it became really effective in the latter half of CS 1.6 were the Eastern European teams. It was the likes of the Poles, of Neo and Taz. It was Na'Vi. What these teams would often do is when they were on T-side, particularly on T-side, because I've always made the case that there's a big difference between force buying on CT and force buying on T-side. On the T-side, the key concept and dynamic as to why you can force buy more on the T-side and why they particularly did and made this work is, first and foremost, they had some of the best superstar players in the world. They had Neo, they had obviously Markelov, they had Edward, and with these kind of incredible players, and particularly very good rifle players as well, if you put a rifle in their hands on the T side, you can have 1 to 2 rifles, or perhaps 2 AKs, a Galil, and then just deagles, or just pistols of any kind. And the reason you can make that force buy work is you can put the guns in the hands of Neo and Markelov, the superstar players, put them early on in a tactic or early on in terms of the position they hold. Then when they take what would be a one-on-one duel with an opponent, they have an equal set of equipment to the opponent. They might win that because they're a better player than the opponent. Then you've got a second gun which can be picked up by the guy behind you. Now that's not different from in theory what you could do on CT side, but on CT side you can't determine where the fight will take place, whereas you could put this guy with the weapon where he would be within a tactic, and therefore the first point of action is a full buy essentially, because the first duel is what would happen anyway with a full team's buy. But here's the key principle which backs up why the terrorist buy can work a lot better with a force buy than a CT side buy can. can. Because on the CT side, if the enemies probe an area, find that someone has the weapon there on what is a half buy and pull back, that guy now has to over-rotate, or they can attack an area without the weapons bought there, and he's rotating in, or they can attack there, kill him, and now the people rotating into the site have no access to the guns that were dropped by the player who force-bought on their team, and they're rotating in dry with pistols, with a UMP, with a low econ buy, and they're not able to make use of that weapon. Whereas on the terrorist side, say a Markov or a Neo goes in with the AK, you only have 1 or 2 AKs, if he dies, it is also often possible for a player coming behind him as part of the terrorist attacking group to pick up that rifle, and therefore he can reuse it. He can recycle that weapon and get extra use out of one weapon purchased that wouldn't be possible on the CT side. And so this was one of the ways that the Poles, that Na'Vi, made use of low econ buys to still be able to win out gun round scenarios against full gun rounds on the CT side when they were playing on T side. They had that kind of pick-up style where the aim was to either use the gun on your best player to get a kill and get a gun that way, to have 2 guns, or if someone died, to pick that weapon up and to keep using it. A key essential concept which still applies to the modern force buy. Now in CSGO, force buys not only accelerated in terms of how much they were used throughout all strata of the scene, but if anything, went into overdrive and went perhaps too far. Now, obviously, we know in 2014, a big part of this was how overpowered the pistols are, where weapons like the 5.7 and the Tech 9 and the CZ, admittedly the Tech 9 wasn't used as much, but were pretty powerful weapons and had very little downside at the time. And if you bought them very, very cheap, along with what were essentially the other people in your team bought the rifles, etc., you could use your angles and your positioning and the range you fought to make it so you weren't at that much of a disadvantage. And famously, the thing about the CZ that made it OP was it didn't even matter how you changed the draw rate and all that stuff. If you could get the kill on the first guy at certain spots, you then got his gun and therefore you upgraded instantly. You were never using the CZ again. That's one of the things that made it a very, very powerful weapon, and the fact that if it was one and done didn't matter. Now obviously the UMP in the latter day, we're talking about like end of 2016, primarily to early 2017, people have seen how powerful that weapon is. Very cheap weapon, obviously. You can buy that in armor with what otherwise would have been the choice where, oh, should I go with like no head armor and an AK? You might not even have to think about that if you're in a situation where you can buy buy the UMP rather, armor, and get a flash or get a smoke or some mini utility to still use and feel like you have a small force buy to go along with your teammates' full weapon buy that he's going to do within the round. Obviously, another component as well as to why force buys are used so much now is that we've moved back, funnily enough, to what the game was like at the beginning of Counter-Strike in 1.6, where the beginning of the game was people stacking the most skilled lineups, because back then, the game heavily rewarded individual play. Individuals could do a lot more with more accurate spray, with more ability to move around in the air and jump. They weren't limited in that particular sense, and a more powerful AWP. So, funnily enough, it's not that any of those factors exist in CSGO, but that people have stacked highly skilled lineups again and again. Think of all the roster moves that happened after the E-League Major at the beginning of this year. They nearly all added more skill, more star players, and upgraded the overall skill level of the top teams in the world. And again, actually, we've seen that with a number of the roster moves going on around this point in time. So you see, those teams are going to be naturally they're going to have a predilection for force buying because they've got so many skilled players. They can get more out of those lower econ weapons, those in theory not as good weapons but cheaper weapons, or out of force buys where they simply just don't have to have the maximum economy to have a full chance to win the round. Whereas you think of teams like Astralis and North, even though they have a lot of skill, their style, it's more along the lines of they're going to play the safer game, the safer economical style. So when you have a G2 or a FaZe, or God forbid, G2 playing FaZe, as we saw at Star Series Season 3, yeah, you're going to get not only more force buys, but more ridiculous force buys, because there's so much talent in those teams, and so much talent with specific pistols, and so much talent, aggressive, fast, dynamic play with the pistols, not slow attacks when you're on a force buy, that they're going to do it more. But that's also because they have more skilled players, not just the power of the weapons themselves. Whereas the Astralis and North of the world, they play a more tactical, more disciplined style, therefore their style is not going to suit force buying as much. Now, a key principle with force buying, which people don't often take into account, even some pros, is that you are weighing up the probability of a gun round win when you go into the force buy. As in, if I was to save now and have a gun round next round, how high is my probability of winning that gun round? The reason why that's a key principle here is because it's worth doing force buys more in situations where you don't really have any good full gun round solutions. Perhaps all your gun rounds this half have just fallen flat, or the enemy had good answers to them, or you have slow gun round setups, a particular couple that you're going to try and slow tempo style attacks haven't worked so far, and you want to speed it up and give your players confidence that since I have a lesser weapon or don't have full utility, I've got to get in their faces, etc. And it's going to change the mentality, it's going to change the style, it's going to change the pace of the game. That's when force buys can be very good, even beyond the economical component, because you don't have something good planned or something reliable that you can grind on a full gun round. So as a result, you can play, as we know, more aggressively with worse weapons because there's less risk on your end when you die, and therefore you're not dropping a gun in that particular scenario. So you can get in the guy's face and try and close the distance if you've got a pistol, etc., or make it more difficult where you're running with a UMP, so he's having a spray against you and there's a couple of you firing against one person. You can do these things that increase the variance. You can also lose the round very easily, but make it tough for the opponent and give you some chances. Now, it's not going to be the case that economically there's less risk. There isn't. In fact, you actually can money fuck yourself even harder, and technically it's not less risk. But in terms of psychology, it certainly has that kind of effect on your team. It's particularly your team more than the opponent that you have the positive effect of making them feel more aggressive and loose, and making them more active and making them go at a faster tempo and pace, which tends to be the way people play out these force buys, these low econ buys on the terrorist side particularly. But even on CT side, people tend to want to make action happen and not sit back and get forced into a bad rotation where they're going against weapons and they won't be able to pick one up. That's why you have teams like the core of LDLC, then Envious, then G2, who famously have been fantastic at winning these pistol rounds, where sometimes their full gun rounds aren't as good, even though you'd think with all their skill, give them even better weapons and more utility, they should get even more done, right? But sometimes they win less. You see it in the current G2 over the last few months. Now, beyond that, there's also a factor where you need to also weigh up when you're doing a force buy how many more rounds you need in a game to win the game. Because it can be totally wrong to do force buys, regardless of whether you break the opponent's enemy, whether you've got amazing players on your team with those lower econ weapons. If all you needed was, say, 2 to 3 more rounds in the game, sometimes it can be incorrect to force buy, regardless of what the economical state of both teams are. If with those 2 to 3 rounds, you have a good T side, a couple of reliable strats, a good read on the opponent for what you're doing on your T side, and the pace is working with your full gun rounds, because in that scenario, you may well have been better off just saying, right, save this one, get a full econ buy next round, and then assuming I can win that because I think I've got a good reliable strat there, I only need a couple more rounds. If I win that, now I'm only, say, 1 round, 2 rounds from winning the whole game. I have many more to work with. I'll even save some of those if I lose them, because I want to get a full 4 to 5 full utility buy rounds, because I only need, say, 2 to 3. Whereas if I do a few force buys now and it doesn't work, now I might be in a scenario where I only get 1 or 2 full gun rounds, and I need to essentially win all of those and maybe 1 or 2 of the force buys, the low econ buys at some point. Otherwise, I just don't win the game. A great example of this, I mean, it was an extreme one because it only just worked out, was in the final of EPL Season 5, where North was playing on Overpass against G2. And G2 did this massive comeback on the CT side, from what I remember, after North had a very good CT side of their own. And part of the reason why the score got so close, but why North still won, is North only needed to grind a couple of rounds. So MSL did full saves. He didn't do a lot of force buying, and instead put his faith in the fact that he had some good T executes and he had a good read of what he wanted to do, and he kept grinding in that way, and he got the round win in the end. Whereas if he'd played into the whole G2 game of force buys and doing crazy buys and just trying crazy random plays, he could have very well just given away the whole game, lost out entirely. I mean, we saw G2 and Na'Vi had a similar kind of ridiculous game where both teams just won CT side massively, and you saw what happened there when Na'Vi didn't have any kind of a T side. So this is an example of where you've got to weigh up not just what's happening in this round in the economy, but what your ultimate win conditions are at that point in the game. Then you've got to consider the economical aspect for the opponent. Now you've got to consider, what will the effect be of me winning this round against the opponent? Because if I can break their money, if they're on the brink economically, and killing even 3 guns will make them have to consider force buying or saving, or I can just break their money entirely, yes, then it can be worth doing as a way to break the opponent, as a way to turn it back so that you'll get a big advantage. You won't just win this round, you'll potentially win 2 or 3 rounds beyond that and have a much higher chance of winning the game. That can be when it's worth doing, or at least in terms of forcing the enemy to buy, even if he doesn't have to outright save. Yes, that can have a component based on it, but people often don't consider the latter. Sometimes people will say that when it's convenient, but they don't realize sometimes they force buy just because they don't know what to do themselves, just because the game's being lost, just because they're frustrated, they don't want to do a full eco, they don't want to go right down another round, but they don't stop and consider, even on the pro level sometimes, amazingly, that actually sometimes even an almost flawless force buy that somehow only lost 1 or 2 guns and actually killed all 5 of the opponent weapons and won the round, if it won't break the enemy's economy, can sometimes be too much of a gamble. It's actually not worth the gamble on your end, since you're not as likely to win the round, whereas they can still survive that, and then now you have to sort of win a force buy, and even then your money might not be that great if you lose 1 or 2 guns, and therefore you're in a tough situation going to the next round anyway, and you're sort of gambling 2 rounds there where you think you're gambling 1 because you haven't thought of the fact that the opponent's economy is a very key element of it. Now, another reason why it can be worth force buying against the enemy is if they will end up in a scenario where even if they win the round, they still have a couple of guns and their economy isn't that great. Therefore, you might trick them or lure them into force buying and therefore putting themselves at a tricky situation for the next round. I mean, think of threat style with NIP. Most famously, it was manifest at Malmo in April of 2016, where they would, on their anti-ecos, not chase guns. They'd allow an opponent to save a gun if he wanted. Or in certain rounds, they'd play very disciplined when there was only 1 or 2 opponents left. And part of this was, if the opponent gets away with the gun, a lot of the teams, particularly Na'Vi in the final fell into this trap, would go ahead and they would buy extra weapons. They would force buy because they had just about enough to make a force buy work, a low econ buy work, and that kept favouring NIP, putting NIP in good situations with full weapons, full economy, against lesser partial buys and low econ buys, and therefore giving them the little extra edge they needed to in that particular set of games where they won 2 very narrow maps, just edge out what was actually a much better team at the time in the world. Now, a key and interesting detail of force buys is people might just think, when I describe the history of how they developed and when they were most prevalent and what the factors were which emphasized or decreased the emphasis on them, they might think, right, so in that case, force buys are mainly tied to like how OP pistols are or how skilled lineups are. But actually, those are secondary components when you consider the mentality of players who choose to force buy. Because I think force buys, no matter how weak pistols become or how much you make a full buy much stronger than a force buy, they will always be present. In fact, they will always be prevalent, in my opinion, even if they're not expedient, even if they really don't work at all, and even if they really gamble too much and don't get you as much in return. Because at the moment, the gamble is actually fairly reasonable with how skilled some of these lineups are and how strong some of the pistols are and how weak, in theory, the spray some of the rifles are in Counter-Strike. One of the reasons why I think this will always exist is because, as Lurpus always says, it's more fun to have a deagle, to have a Tech 9, to do a force buy, to feel like you got away with it by winning back a round that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to win because you'd been on a save or a low or just a pistol buy and saving for a full gun round at that point in time. You feel like you're getting away with something. It feels more fun because you feel like you have a chance to kill people. This affects even pros. There's a great quote by the American poet Bukowski, which I think sums this up. It says, "I remember a friend of mine who was a total gambler. He told me once, 'I don't care if I win or lose. I just want to gamble.'" There are a lot of pros who would think that way. There's a lot of fantastic CIS players who would be amazing if they gave up this round and were willing to save as a team and get full gun rounds next round. Think of some of the great grinding Gambit and Na'Vi teams, or players like Simple and Flamey. Incredible players. You put a rifle in their hands, they're some of the best players in the entire world, best players we've ever seen. But the amount of times they'll gamble and go for the Deagle or the Tech 9 or the CZ or whatever it might be, because it's more fun, because they're so skilled they think they can get away with it. Funnily enough, people will gamble wanting to win, wanting the positive of it, and ignoring the negatives, no matter how poor the odds get. Think about Na'Vi from early 2016, the team that was making second place every single time, even at the major. This is a team where the best player on their team, and arguably the best player in the world, was Guardian, who was not only their best player, and therefore you'd want his best gun in his hand, but he's an AWPer, so you'd want an AWP in his hand, and then worse, he's not just an AWPer, like Kenny S has been the best AWPer in the team, but hasn't always had the whole system built around him, but their entire Na'Vi T-style approach was built around Guardian having an AWP and making that as effective as possible with the slow map control, setting him up for a pick, then attacking a site once you've identified and read what the defense is like. And yet, despite this, go watch the games, Na'Vi do way more force buys than you expect from a team with those win conditions, with those strengths. And so many times, Guardian himself, and I talked to some of their coaches at the time, is the one saying, I want to buy a Deagle now, let's do a force buy now, rather than waiting to get your team at its maximum strength and give yourself the best chance to win the game, and with one of the best grinding T-sides that was in all of Counter-Strike, arguably the best at that point in time, and they didn't always maximize it, despite the fact for a team like them, it didn't make as much sense to force buy. They were going to have higher chances of winning the game with Guardian on AWP and with full buy for the team and being able to execute that slow style, which you need utility for. So amazingly, it doesn't matter. Likewise, you see at the moment, Kenny S is the clear best player on G2. There are other players who come close to him at times, but he's the clear star. He's the one reliable factor you can point to every game, and if you put an AWP in his hand, he has a very high chance of giving G2 a win in the game. But what did G2? They are one of the teams that force buy the most. They are a team who embrace the force buy over the full buy so many times, and that puts so many fewer AWPs into Kenny S's hands, and that reduces and limits Kenny S's impact, and sometimes negates his impact when he has a fantastic game but can't get enough AWPs or can't get enough support from his team, and therefore they don't get as many big results as they might otherwise do when you look at the lineup and you look at some of their best games, and they gamble away their future on these force buys. So there are many factors that are going to play into if people force buy. There's the team style. If you want a slow style and you want to set up specific players, it's not going to be as effective to force buy. If you have a fast-paced team, if you have a loose team, if you have a team with very skilled players who like aggressive one-on-one play and who can play up close, yeah, force buying is going to work for you. So it's not just the style, it's the personnel that's going to feed into the style as well, because that's what's going to determine your style ultimately if you're a top team anyway. Then there's the fact that I think the age where force buys will become more attuned and become more reasonable relative to how effective they are will be in the era when we have full coaching, when teams are worth millions of dollars and you have a full coaching staff and you have a defensive coach, you have an offensive coach, you have a head coach who really gets to determine this is the style we want to play and here are the components to make it up, and listen to the player over here, let's go through game footage. I think you went too far on this one here. I want us next time to do a little bit of different style of economic management. When that exists and it's not just players picking it, when essentially someone charts it out like in basketball or football and picks out the most high percentage plays for his players and his team as a whole, that's when you'll see a smarter approach, more in line with the principles of force buying from the pros. Whereas at the moment, even pro-level players often are very off and very wonky in terms of their force buying, unless the entire team forces them not to be.
Hello, I'm male feminist Anders Bloom, and because all lives matter here at Thorin's channel, I give you a big welcome.